For the past 30 days now, when it comes to developing software, I've been exclusively using what's known as vibe coding, which means that rather than me writing a single line of code, I've instead deferred the act entirely to AI. Now, if you follow along with my content, then you probably realize that this is somewhat of a departure from how I normally like to build software. In fact, I still don't use an AI assistant or copilot inside of my text editor. Instead, when I do write code, I like to do so manually by hand. So given this personal preference, why then did I spend the last month not only using AI, but deferring all of my written code to it? Well, like most developers that I know, when I first heard of vibe coding, I initially thought it sounded ridiculous. Not only was I skeptical that it could produce anything more than a simple toy application, but I also assumed that it would only create code that would be desired by malicious entities, in the worst case containing a number of high-sev vulnerabilities, but in the best case being a headache for any future developers in the form of a maintenance mess. Despite this preconceived notion, however, I like to consider myself an open-minded individual, and whilst we have seen some real-world issues from non-developers attempting to vibe code, there are some experienced developers claiming great success with AI agents. And so I decided to both challenge my own assumptions and to better understand the practice of vibe coding in order to come to my own conclusion about whether or not it was viable, and if it was, how it might impact the future of software development. In order to do so, I decided to set myself a 30-day challenge. But before I jumped in and started vibe coding, I first laid out the rules and the plan for the challenge itself. In order to fully embrace this new practice, I decided that for 30 days, any and all code related to SaaS products, production services, internal tooling, and anything that I wanted to create from a productivity point of view would be done through an LLM agent. However, I did lay out 3 different exceptions. The first of which was if I had a critical bug that I needed to fix in a timely manner, then I would be able to revert to doing this by hand. The second exception was that if I wanted to learn or understand a new concept, such as a language or framework, again, I would allow myself to learn this by hand rather than delegating it through an AI. The last exception that I made was anything related to content for YouTube videos, except of course this one. With my exceptions defined, the next thing to go ahead and do was to figure out what I wanted to actually build. In order to fully test the capabilities of vibe coding in real-world situations, I wanted to make sure I was going to use it with a number of different project lifecycles. The 3 major lifecycles that I wanted to cover included an existing project running in production, both fixing bugs and adding new features to it, rewriting an existing project into a new language or framework, so for example from Go to Next.js, and building an entirely new project from scratch. Once I had a plan for what I wanted to build during these 30 days, as well as the associated rules for how I was going to build it, the next thing I needed to do was to select my vibe coding weapon of choice. The first tool I looked at was Cursor, which it feels like pretty much everyone and their dog is using these days. However, personally, Cursor just didn't feel right for me. For some reason, I can't get behind the hybrid editor/agent approach, and given that I wanted to exclusively vibe code, removing the editor from the mix was the only way for me to go. And so I decided to both pass on Cursor and Windsurf, and instead decided to go with an option that spoke more to my personal preferences: Claude Code, which is an in-terminal AI agent that operates on your own machine. For my own personal workflow of using the terminal with tmux and CLI tooling, then Claude Code actually felt like a really nice fit. In fact, it was actually so good that I've managed to do some really cool things with it, but I'll talk about those another time. In any case, with both my challenge defined and my weapon of choice selected, I was ready to accept my first vibe coding quest. Because I was initially skeptical about the code quality that would be produced, I decided that the safest project to begin with would be to rewrite my Dreams of Code frontend from Go into Next.js. By doing so, it would provide a couple of key benefits when it came to vibe coding. The first of which is that I could easily compare the act of building a codebase from scratch by using vibe coding with what it took for me to build it by hand before. And because I wasn't going to be figuring out which features I wanted to add to this project, then I could effectively just focus on the vibe coding itself. This would not only make comparison easier, but it also meant I wouldn't spend time bashing my head against a wall trying to figure out what it was I wanted to build. This also meant that if I got stuck along the way, I could provide a reference implementation to the LLM through my existing Go project. The second major benefit that this project provided was that it wasn't going to be deployed in production, which meant there wasn't a risk of it causing anything fundamental to break. However, because I wanted this to feel like a real project, then I did end up pushing this to be deployed under a separate subdomain, so that I could still test it as if it were a fully deployed application, just without the risk of it accidentally breaking prod. In any case, with my first project defined, I began vibe coding, trying to see how fast I could get a parity version of my Dreams of Code website up and running. However, it didn't take long for me to encounter my first issue: cost. At the start of my first day, I had loaded up my Anthropic balance to a cool $25, which for some reason I had expected to last me maybe the full day. In reality, however, I only made it about 2 hours before I received an email letting me know I no longer had any balance. After firing up the Python REPL in order to do some advanced calculation, I realized that at a cost of $25 for 2 hours, then it would cost me around $100 for an 8-hour day of coding. This would have translated to around $3,000 for the full 30 days. Ouch. After quickly conferring with my accountant, I came to the conclusion that it would be worthwhile to fork out for the Claude Max plan, which comes in at either $100 or $200 a month, with increased usage limits defined respectively. As someone who loves to save a bit of money wherever I can, I decided to go for the lower cost option, and in the event that I hit these usage limits, then I would consider scaling up. As it turns out, I never exceeded the limits of the $100 plan, although I did come close later on when I was juggling 3 projects at once. In any case, by using the Claude Max plan, it ended up being much more affordable compared to pay-as-you-go, which is something I never thought I'd say about a $100 a month subscription. But considering how much I actually got done in those 30 days, I'd go as far as saying that $100 a month is an absolute steal. But it does make me wonder whether or not this is actually profitable for Anthropic, and is something to be potentially concerned about in the future. In any case, with the indefinite vibe coding ability unlocked, I was now able to start pumping out code, which I was doing. Perhaps a little too much, however, as I kept running into what I would consider is the first major boss when it comes to vibe coding. This is where the LLM starts to deteriorate or run out of stamina after vibing for an extended period of time. In my case, I kept running into this issue whenever I would prompt the agent to begin implementing an entire new feature. And whilst it would initially start on the right track, the longer it went on with the implementation, the more it would drift from where I was hoping it would end up. This drift not only caused the implementation to be flawed in one way or another, but it would sometimes affect other areas of code which I didn't want the LLM to touch. Initially, this was incredibly frustrating, but after doing some research, it turns out that this is a well-documented issue when it comes to LLMs performing long-running coding tasks, in what's described as a sort of agent half-life, meaning that the longer an agent performs a task, the less accurate it gets. However, upon reading this research, I realized that this wasn't a phenomenon that affected LLMs alone, as I've often myself been known to produce garbage code whenever I've tackled a feature that has been scoped way too large. Whilst in my case, the most effective way to mitigate this effect is with either a tasty snack or refreshing drink, this approach doesn't exactly work when it comes to using an LLM. Fortunately, it's not the only mitigation strategy that exists, and so instead I decided to use another one that has also been effective in my experience, which is to break up larger features into smaller bite-sized tasks. This was also my first indication that whilst vibe coding is fundamentally different from the way we've written code before, it's very similar to acting like a tech lead on a team, and rather than having human team members, it's instead an AI agent, which of course has its own pros and cons. In any case, with this new insight, rather than asking Claude to implement an entire feature from scratch, I instead decided to operate it as if I was writing tasks that were going to be assigned to a more junior engineer. This form of ticket writing ended up being the ticket for success, and I found that Claude Code was much better at producing these more concrete tasks successfully. This had the added benefit that because the changes were now smaller, it was easier for me to verify what had actually changed. After a couple of days of taking this new approach, I had effectively managed to get feature parity with the Dreams of Code website, in just a fraction of the time it had originally taken me to implement. Not only this, but Claude also managed to solve a number of issues that I encountered in my original implementation, and also added in some improvements compared to my original code. Not only had it reached feature parity, but it was starting to improve my original implementation. comprehension. That being said, there were often times that Claude would produce absolute garbage. But fortunately, now that I wasn't worried about cost, I could either just prompt my way through these or blast the code away with a simple git reset. Perhaps the biggest lesson that I learned through this time, however, was to start to let go. Initially, I was kind of concerned about the lack of comprehension about the codebase itself, which is something that I've always prided myself on in the past, having a good mental map of the code and where to jump in the case that a bug comes up. When it came to vibe coding, however, I had no mental map of the codebase itself, which initially felt kind of wrong. However, once I began to embrace this feeling, I then realized I didn't actually need it at all. And if I did need to find any code, I could either make use of CLI tools that I'm already familiar with, or I could just ask Claude Code to tell me what was going on. This thinking also extended to debugging, in that whenever a bug or issue did emerge, rather than diving into the code to understand what the root cause was, I would instead just send any and all information about the bug that I had to hand, such as the expected behavior versus what was actually happening, as well as any error logging that may emerge inside of the console. For the most part, this approach worked really well, and Claude could take the information that I provided to it and end up resolving the issue. It certainly wasn't perfect, sometimes it would take a couple of prompts to get there, but for the most part, I found myself not needing to dive into the actual code. Overall, the first week for me felt like a masterclass in learning to delegate, and whilst it did go off to a bit of a rocky start, by the end of the first week, I ended up being somewhat productive. In any case, with feature parity achieved in what I would consider record time, I decided to move on to my next task, which was extending this next JS rewrite with an entirely new feature: an admin dashboard. This feature was not only new, but also required some database changes, which meant that this was going to be the first time that I was modifying production in some way. Because of this, I made sure to test and review these changes as much as physically possible, especially as it was now adding new SQL migrations in order to support the new admin role. This is also where my Postgres provider, Neon, came in handy, due to the fact that I was able to branch my production data to ensure it wasn't going to cause anything to break in actual prod. Whilst the LLM worked well when it came to performing database migrations, one area that I did find less impressive was when it came to designing a user interface. Whenever it came to implementing a new user interface for a feature, I found that most of the time Claude would tend to prefer function over form. Whilst this is fine for things such as admin dashboards, when it comes to more user-facing features, this can sometimes be a bit of an issue. However, from speaking with other developer friends who were also using Claude Code at the same time, then I found that this is pretty much a common experience. And once I understood this limitation, it ended up becoming solvable. Again, the solution here is to treat this as if you're working as part of a team. However, rather than working with, say, a junior engineer, this time working with a junior UX designer, and therefore, in this case, asking it to iterate on the designs it was producing. Additionally, you can also provide images for Claude Code to reference, which I found to be somewhat hit or miss. In fact, the best case of using images I often found was when there were visual bugs, but you could also use it to ask Claude to reference various designs. However, what I found to be most effective is when I was building multiple related products to one another, I would ask Claude to go ahead and reference one of the existing landing pages that I had, in order to keep the style reasonably consistent. In addition to user interfaces, the other main area of concern I had when it came to vibe coding was around application security, especially as this seems to be perhaps one of the biggest talking points for reasons against the practice. However, after vibe coding for a couple of weeks, I was less concerned about security issues than I was initially. And currently, my conclusion is that I think these security concerns are somewhat of a red herring. Not because they don't exist, they absolutely do. Instead, however, it's because that these issues also exist when it comes to handwritten code. Therefore, the best way that I found to reduce the risk of security issues is to basically act like you're working with other developers that may not know best practices when it comes to security. This means it's both important to have a decent understanding of application security, whilst also making sure to review any code that you know might be problematic, because it's almost a guarantee that Claude will eventually do something insecure. In my case, I often found that Claude would sometimes spin up test endpoints that were open to the entire world for things like testing email sending or other actions that I really didn't want to be made publicly available. One thing that I found to be valuable later on was setting up automation of static analysis tools, so things such as linters, as well as security scanning software such as Trivy or Clair. This encounter with both security issues and with the number of bugs that Claude would often produce was the perhaps leading indicator that software developer jobs are most likely going to be safe, even if the way that we write 80% of our code may change. Instead, I expect to see agentic AI as either a tool that needs supervised operation, or as being more of an additional team member which can help to pick up well-written tasks in your backlog that other people don't have time for. As well as starting to see vibe coding being a force multiplier, it wasn't long until I began to see another benefit of the practice, as during this time, I also decided to head back to the UK in order to spend time with family. Normally, whenever I fly back to the UK, whilst I fully intend to spend a good chunk of that time producing code, I always end up failing to do so, most likely due to the cramped conditions of flying in economy. This, for me, typically makes writing code very much uncomfortable, and so I end up giving up pretty quickly. This time, however, because I was just typing prompts, it was actually a lot easier to achieve than typing out code. And because of this, it ended up being perhaps the most productive flight I'd ever taken. Of course, I did need to obtain in-flight internet, which only cost me around $25. However, once I was connected, my plane-based workflow basically consisted of me queuing up tasks for Claude to work on, whilst I just sat back and watched an in-flight movie. In fact, this plane journey is where I started to appreciate that vibe coding now unlocked a multitasking-based workflow, where I could both vibe code and do other things at the same time. This multitasking revelation was something that I ended up taking with me beyond the actual flight. However, it unfortunately wasn't the only thing that I picked up. This is because, during that flight, I also managed to catch COVID, the 2025 edition. Fortunately, the sequel isn't as bad as the original, but it did cause me to feel rough for an entire week. Despite this, however, I was still able to be productive, which is something I'm not usually able to do whenever I come down with a cold. However, when it came to vibe coding, because all I needed to do was articulate what I wanted, followed by verifying that it was implemented, then I was able to achieve quite a lot of work. By the end of the second week, I not only had an admin dashboard up and running, but I'd also managed to add a couple of new features into the Next.js implementation. And so I was starting to trust that vibe coding could be used for writing production-ready code. With this newfound confidence, I decided to start adding features to my existing Dreams of Code Go application. Initially, I was a little worried that using vibe coding wouldn't work well with my stack of Go, Temple, Alpine, and HTMX. And whilst there were some times that it would raw dog JavaScript rather than going through the Alpine.js approach, for the most part, it worked reasonably well. That being said, it definitely didn't work out as well as using Next.js, which is something that I kind of expected going in. This, to me, is something that I think is a little bit concerning about the future of software development, as I worry that the rise of AI tooling will sort of add a forcing function to push us more towards a developer monoculture, which honestly I believe would be a detriment to the community as whole. However, I'm no oracle, so we'll just have to see how that one plays out. In any case, by the end of week 2, I was starting to focus more on what vibe coding was adding to my life, rather than what it was potentially taking away. This is because I was starting to use multitasking more and more when it came to vibe coding, especially as the Switch 2 came out that week. Typically in the past, whenever I've had to make a choice between playing video games and writing code, I've always deferred to writing code, otherwise I tend to feel a crushing weight of guilt that I'm not doing anything productive. However, when it came to vibe coding, I was able to both play video games and build software at the same time. Now, of course, this wasn't ever going to be as productive as if I was doing dedicated vibe coding, but it was infinitely more productive than if I was only writing code by hand. In addition to video games, this ability to multitask also extended to other areas as well, including things like watching movies or just doing general house chores. One thing that I really took away from this experience is that I was starting to prefer my thinner and lighter laptops, and so I would often reach for either my Framework 13 or my MacBook Air over my more heavier Framework 16 or MacBook Pro. Yes, I know I have a lot of devices. That's something I'm going to rectify probably in the near future. In addition to learning to multitask effectively, I was also starting to learn how to maximize my efficiency when it came to both vibe coding as well as reviewing the changes that were made. I've got a whole suite of videos planned to go into this in more detail, but basically the general gist is ensuring that you have multiple agents going at once and then streamlining the review process through things like CI/CD, review apps, and also making sure that you have automated testing and security scanning. One thing that I think is going to be really valuable in the near future are any skills or products that can improve the overall experience when it comes to working with agentic AI that's generating code. In any case, through this week, I had successfully managed to add new features to my Dreams of Code website without causing anything to break. Because of this, I had managed to prove to myself that vibe coding works on an existing production service. This meant it was now time to move on to the final project that I wanted to test it out with, which was building a new one from scratch. As for what this project was, in this case, I decided to turn the idea that I had for automated blog posts into reality, and so I went about building zenblog.ai, which allows content creators to automatically turn their YouTube videos into well-formatted blog posts. For this project, rather than using my preferred tech stack, I instead decided to lean into using Next.js again, in order to build something as fast as possible, especially given that LLMs tend to prefer using it. This, however, ended up being both a good and a bad thing. Whilst this was incredibly fast, I kept running into what I would define as AI monoculture issues. For example, for this project, I wanted to make use of BetterAuth for authentication, which, by the way, is an absolutely fantastic framework. However, despite me asking Claude to use BetterAuth when it came to setting up authentication, I found it would often act as if it had taken a tab or two of acid, and basically would hallucinate that I'd asked it to use NextAuth instead, likely because that's where a lot of the training data is. This kept happening to me for a couple of prompt iterations, until I decided to figure out a way to solve it. Fortunately, the solution ended up being pretty simple. Upon reading the Claude Code documentation, I discovered two different approaches that you can take, both of which are focused around context loading. The first solution, which ended up working for me to get BetterAuth up and running, was to ask Claude to implement it as per the documentation, of which I provided to it as a URL. Claude Code was then able to go ahead and fetch this URL, asking for permission first, in order to load the installation instructions into its context. This then allowed it to go through each of the steps and worked pretty much perfectly. Almost. There was one step in the instructions that it would get slightly wrong, which was for my own personal setup. This was where it would try to migrate the database for me, but because I was using Drizzle, then this migrate command didn't work. Fortunately, again, the solution here was to just be explicit with the LLM, telling it to use the generate command instead of the migrate one. In addition to learning to provide URLs for more context, the other major thing that I learned from reading the Claude Code documentation was the value of using a claude.md file. This file allows you to define your project's attributes that Claude will load into its context before running any commands. So in my case, I would use it to define both the architectural decisions of my application, so things like using BetterAuth, using Bun instead of NPM, the fact that I was using Drizzle with Neon, etc., etc. This allows Claude to have a better understanding of your project, both in its intention as well as its dependencies. Additionally, if you couple this with any of the URLs for those dependencies documentation, then I find it helps to make the generated code even more accurate. Another way that I used this file, which I found to be very valuable, was to specify any acceptance criteria for generated code. So making sure that after every feature was implemented, both the code would build using the bun run build command, but also that the automated tests were passing. Again, all of this I'll probably talk about in another video, as it's a really powerful way of making sure that vibe coding works effectively. In any case, through vibe coding exclusively, I managed to get the MVP of my zenblog.ai service built in only a couple of days. If I had built the same thing by hand, coupled with my day job, it probably would have taken me about a month. That being said, there was one scenario where I wasted a lot of time with vibe coding, which was when I asked it to implement video processing in the browser using FFmpeg WASM for my most recent project. In this case, I was prompting Claude to add support for video files greater than 2 GB in size, which isn't supported by FFmpeg WASM when using the in-memory file system. Instead, rather than memfs, one needs to use workerfs, which allows for much larger files, but in a read-only context. Unfortunately, Claude just didn't know how to do this, most likely because there's not that many examples of doing this out on the internet. However, given AI's predisposition to attempt requests before determining that it isn't possible, it ended up producing a few different implementations, none of which worked. This ended up causing me to waste a lot of time, which is a bit annoying when you're trying to move as quickly as possible. In the end, I had to break my vibe coding challenge rules and write an implementation of doing this by hand, which I could then provide Claude as a reference for it to implement itself. Therefore, I once again came to the same conclusion that vibe coding is best for doing simple coding tasks, and the operator itself should be delegating to both breaking down those tasks, whilst also considering the feasibility and providing reference implementations for anything that's more novel or esoteric. In any case, with the successful implementation of my zenblog.ai service, that wrapped up the 30-day vibe coding challenge. So how has my opinion changed on the entire thing? Well, in case you hadn't been able to tell, I actually really enjoyed it. Initially, I was really skeptical that it was going to be of any use. However, by the end of it, I was not only really productive, but I was also able to understand where its limitations lie. Now, that being said, I won't be using vibe coding exclusively. There are still some situations that I really like to dive into the code, and that I like to still write code by hand. Additionally, I'm not going to be using any text editors that have AI or LLM copilots built in. However, when it comes to using tools like Claude Code, I can definitely see a use for it in my own workflow, especially when it comes to building web applications that I want to turn into products as quickly as possible. Additionally, I'm also looking forward to trying out some other AI or agentic-based tooling in the future. I briefly looked at ChatGPT Codex during the 30 days, but I didn't find it was right for me. However, I do think I need to spend a bit more time with it in order to come to a conclusion. As for what I think vibe coding means for the future of software development, well, as I've mentioned already, I still think that knowing how to build software is going to be important. And to be honest, the role of software developer was never just about writing code exclusively. Whilst using tools such as Claude Code can help to increase productivity, there's still some fundamental skills that are needed in order to be able to successfully develop software. However, because these skills are somewhat less technical, then it can often feel a little harder to know what they are. So I'm going to make sure to do more content in the future that looks at these skills specifically. Additionally, I also think that we're going to be seeing new bottlenecks in the software development lifecycle, specifically around both code and application review, something of which I've spent a bit of time optimizing over the past couple of weeks. And so I've got a few videos planned on my own personal workflow as well. In any case, that's pretty much everything that I experienced over the past 30 days of vibe coding. And whilst it was pretty fun, I am really glad to be back to being able to type out code by hand when I need to, rather than just arguing with Claude on how to implement something effectively. In any case, that's all from me. But I'd love to hear from you. Have you tried Claude Code yet, and what are your thoughts on it? As always, let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I want to give a big thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.